Hi, Guy. Tonight we trade Belgian trenches for the sun-baked grandeur of Naqsh-e-Rustam. You, my friend, are a royal herald, voice cracking under the weight of another impending edict. Dust devils dance across the necropolis, a fitting backdrop, as you probably won't survive this retelling of Darius's Scythian invasion. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment with your current coordinates. Shout-out time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge up the steps, sandals slapping against hot stone, adjusting your linen robes. Naqsh-e-Rustam, for those playing along at home, holds the tombs of Achaemenid kings. Just a little historical tidbit for you. Your throat is drier than a mummy's toenail, thanks to that fermented date wine they call refreshment. Let me tell you, it's less refreshing and more regretting. Oh, and the pressure? You're about to announce Darius I's grand plan, another glorious misadventure into Scythia, land of horse-obsessed nomads. Fringe fact, and this is a good one. The Scythians supposedly used enemy skulls as drinking cups. Historians still argue whether their dental hygiene was worse than the average Achaemenid courtiers. Something to ponder while we continue. Darius, all ego and embroidered trousers, waits above. You're definitely not his favorite person right now. Your job satisfaction currently ranks slightly below a eunuch guarding the harem. Just saying. Darius, surrounded by spear-wielding immortals, taps a manicured fingernail on his gilded throne. He glowers at you from behind an elaborate false beard. Apparently being king of kings also comes with male-patterned baldness. Who knew? Your palms sweat inside your leather wristband. This won't end well for anyone, especially you, the messenger. The air shimmers with the heat, the silence broken only by the buzzing of flies and the occasional cough from a particularly ancient immortal. You can practically smell the disapproval radiating from the king. He gestures impatiently for you to begin. You clear your throat, the sound amplified in the oppressive stillness. By order of the King of Kings, Darius, the Great King, King of Persia, King of Countries, son of Hystaspes, and Achaemenid, you begin, reciting the obligatory, ridiculously long title. You sneak a glance at Darius. His expression hasn't changed. You continue, your voice gaining a slight tremor. Proclaims a new campaign, a glorious expedition to the lands beyond the Black Sea. To Scythia. A ripple of murmurs passes through the assembled courtiers. Some shift nervously, others exchange knowing glances. No one looks particularly enthusiastic. They've seen this movie before, and it doesn't end well. The Scythians, you see, aren't exactly known for their welcoming committees. They're more of the scorched earth, poisoned well, runaway laughing type of hosts. You swallow hard and press on, detailing the planned route, the logistical nightmares of supplying an army across vast, inhospitable steppes, and the, shall we say, optimistic projections of victory. You embellish a little, adding extra flourishes about the riches to be plundered and the glory to be won. It's what Darius wants to hear, even if it's about as realistic as a snowstorm in Persepolis. As you speak, your mind wanders. You imagine yourself back home, tending your fig trees, enjoying the simple pleasures of life, far away from the whims of a megalomaniacal king. You picture your wife, her warm smile, the smell of her freshly baked bread. You'll probably never see her again. You finish the proclamation with a flourish, your voice cracking on the final, triumphant note. Silence descends once more. Darius rises from his throne, his embroidered trousers shimmering in the sunlight. He surveys the assembled crowd, his expression unreadable. Then he speaks, his voice booming across the necropolis. Who among you will lead this glorious campaign? A long, awkward pause follows. The courtiers avoid eye contact, shuffling their feet. The silence stretches, thick and heavy. Crickets chirp. A fly lands on Darius's nose. He swats it away impatiently. Finally, a brave, or perhaps foolish, young nobleman steps forward. He bows deeply before the king. "Your Majesty," he declares, his voice trembling slightly, "I am ready to serve." Darius smiles, a predatory glint in his eye. "Excellent," he purrs. "Prepare yourself. And you," he adds, turning his gaze to you, the herald, "prepare to announce our departure throughout the land." Your stomach sinks. You knew this was coming. You bow your head, accepting your fate. As you descend the steps of Naqsh-e-Rustam, The setting sun casts long shadows across the ancient tombs. The dust devils swirl around you, a silent mockery of the grand pronouncements and empty promises of the day. You think about the Scythians, about their skulls and their horses and their scorched earth tactics. You wonder if they have any openings for a slightly used herald. Probably not. You sigh, the weight of your burden heavy on your shoulders. You have a long journey ahead of you, a journey fraught with peril and uncertainty. But for now, you have a job to do. You must announce the king's folly to the world. And you must hope, against all hope, that you live to tell the tale. So, until next time, my friends, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, don't drink from any skulls. Just don't. Darius's voice boomed, a rich baritone that somehow managed to blend the smoothness of honey with the sharp edge of a threat. It filled the vast, sun-drenched courtyard, echoing off the elaborately carved stone walls. He paced before the assembled troops, a captive audience of bronze and leather, his every gesture radiating imperial power. He spoke of the Scythians, not as the elusive nomadic horsemen they were, masters of the vast, unforgiving steppes, but as treasure troves waiting to be unlocked. He painted vivid pictures of their legendary riches, ripe for the plucking, gold and jewels glittering beneath the endless sky. He conveniently forgot, or perhaps deliberately omitted, the fact that the Scythians were experts in disappearing into the vastness of their homeland like smoke on the wind. They were renowned for their horsemanship, their archery skills, and their unique cultural practices. Like, for instance, that little habit they had of ritualistically tattooing themselves with scorpion venom. I mean, sure, a little scorpion venom is probably better than smearing yourself with crocodile dung for sun protection, which was apparently a thing in some parts of the empire. But still, scorpion venom tattoos. Not exactly a sign of a people eager to surrender their wealth to the first king who fancies it. And fancy it, Darius did. He declared his divine right to conquer these nomadic tribes, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. He spoke of destiny and glory, of expanding the Persian Empire to the very edges of the known world. Why, you might ask, would a powerful emperor like Darius choose to invade a vast, sparsely populated territory defended by highly mobile warriors known for their ferocity and cunning? Good question. Historians are still arguing about whether this was Darius's worst decision. Some say his Egyptian campaign was more disastrous, others point to the Ionian revolt. My bladder, however, currently experiencing the intense pressure of holding back several hours' worth of fear-induced urine, is pretty damn clear on its opinion. This was bad. Very, very bad. The air thrummed with the weight of his words. I stood on the sidelines, throat tighter than a camel's saddlebag strap, clutching the scroll containing the official proclamation. My job, as royal herald, was to deliver the king's message to the troops. A job that, at this moment, felt less like an honor and more like a death sentence. I unfurled the scroll, my fingers trembling slightly. My voice, when I began to read, was surprisingly steady, though perhaps a bit higher pitched than usual. The words of the proclamation echoed across the valley, bouncing off the ancient stone faces of long-dead kings carved into the cliffs of Naqsh-Rustam. The irony was not lost on me. Those carvings depicted scenes of royal triumph, of glorious victories. This campaign, I suspected, would be anything but. In my head, I was already composing my resignation speech, tentatively titled, "Better a Live Herald Than a Scythian Skullcap." Darius, his pronouncement complete, waved a dismissive hand in my direction. I was dismissed, like an unwanted fly at a royal banquet. I bowed deeply, hiding my grimace behind a carefully neutral expression. The only thing lower than my current morale was the hem of my robe, dragging in the dust of the courtyard. As I trudged down the steps, the weight of the king's folly pressing down on me like a physical burden, I started to contemplate how exactly I was going to break this news to my family. Honey, I'm home. Good news, everyone. Dad's going on another business trip. Bad news. It involves Scythians, and the life insurance policy probably won't pay out this time. My sandals scraped against the stone, each step a slow march towards an uncertain future. The sun beat down on my neck, the heat reflecting the growing inferno of anxiety in my stomach. Darius's words, so full of confidence and bravado, still rang in my ears. He had spoken of riches and glory, of conquest and divine right. He had failed to mention, however, the small but crucial detail that the Scythians had absolutely no intention of cooperating with his grand plans. They were a people of the wind, of the vast open steppes, and they would not be easily contained. Trying to conquer them was like trying to capture smoke with your bare hands. As I reached the bottom of the steps, I took a deep breath, the dry desert air doing little to quench the thirst that had settled in my throat. The vastness of the empire stretched before me, a landscape of rolling hills and distant mountains, the very same landscape that the Scythians called home. And somewhere out there, in that seemingly endless expanse, an army of nomadic horsemen was waiting for Darius, waiting for his grand army, waiting to unleash the fury of the steppes upon them. I shuddered. My bladder, still protesting, reminded me that perhaps now was a good time to find a secluded spot behind a conveniently placed rock. The fate of the empire could wait. My bladder couldn't. News of the invasion rippled across Persepolis like a plague, an invisible tremor shaking the foundations of the opulent city. The air, normally thick with the scent of incense and exotic spices, now carried a different tang, the metallic scent of fear. Merchants, their faces etched with worry, frantically packed their wares, silks and spices hastily bundled into sacks, anticipating the inevitable disruption of trade. Soldiers, a more stoic bunch, polished their weapons, a grim acceptance settling over them as they anticipated something slightly less thrilling than trade disruption, namely, getting stabbed repeatedly by horse-mounted barbarians. I made my way through the bustling, anxious streets towards my home, my own heart echoing the city's unease. This wasn't my first dance with the Scythians, and the memories, like the lingering taste of fermented mare's milk, weren't pleasant. I visited my family one last time, the familiar comfort of my home, a temporary balm against the growing dread. I hugged my children tight, their small bodies warm and trusting against mine. "I'll be back soon," I promised, forcing a smile, "with tales of Scythian unicorns and mountains of gold." A small, unconvinced sniffle was my reward. My wife, however, offered no such comforting illusion. She simply met my gaze, her eyes filled with a knowing weariness that spoke volumes. It was the look that said, "If you come back as a skullcup, I'm remarrying." Historians still argue whether that's considered a valid prenuptial clause, but at that moment, the finer points of marital law seemed somewhat less pressing than, say, not getting turned into a drinking vessel. The next few days were a blur of hurried preparations and whispered rumors. The city buzzed with a nervous energy, like a hive about to be smoked out. Then, the rumors solidified into chilling fact. Scythian spies had infiltrated Persepolis, disguised as olive merchants. They blended in perfectly, except for the slight aroma of horse and questionable dental work. Apparently, horse-based dentistry hadn't quite made it to the steppes yet. These weren't your run-of-the-mill spies, whispering sweet nothings of treason and regime change into the ears of disgruntled nobles. No, these spies were whispering something far more unsettling. Not whispers of conquest, but of scorched earth, of strategic retreat. Turns out, disappearing into the steppes isn't just a weekend hobby. It's a national defense strategy. The Scythians, it seemed, weren't planning on staying for tea and crumpets. They planned to burn everything, grab what they could carry, and vanish back into the vastness of their homeland, leaving nothing but ashes and bewildered historians in their wake. This wasn't exactly news that inspired confidence in the local populace. The image of our meticulously manicured gardens and grand palaces reduced to smoldering rubble wasn't exactly conducive to a good night's sleep. The thought of facing an enemy who considered retreat a victory, well, it made my palms start sweating again. I'd tasted Scythian hospitality before. It involved a lot of fermented mare's milk, an acquired taste, to put it mildly, even more side-eye, and a general sense that you were about one wrong move away from becoming a decorative wall hanging. I recalled one particularly memorable evening spent in a Scythian yurt, the air thick with the smells of horse, smoke, and something vaguely resembling cheese. The chieftain, a man whose beard seemed to have a life of its own, had offered me a bowl of what he claimed was a local delicacy. It looked, smelled, and tasted suspiciously like curdled yak's milk. I'd managed to swallow a mouthful, my face contorting into an expression that I hoped conveyed polite appreciation rather than imminent regurgitation. The chieftain, observing my struggle, had simply grunted and taken the bowl back, muttering something about soft southerners. That experience, combined with the current rumors, painted a rather bleak picture. This wasn't going to be a glorious battle with clearly defined winners and losers, celebrated in song and story for generations to come. This was going to be messy. A chaotic, brutal scramble for survival against an enemy who played by a different set of rules. An enemy who considered a scorched earth retreat a resounding triumph. The weight of the impending conflict pressed down on me, a heavy cloak woven from fear and uncertainty. The city around me, despite its outward appearance of bustling activity, felt strangely hushed, as if holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. The whispers of the Scythian spies, though seemingly aimed at sowing fear and discord, had inadvertently revealed something far more dangerous. The unsettling truth that the enemy we faced wasn't driven by the same desires for conquest and glory that fueled our own empire. They were a force of nature, as unpredictable and unforgiving as the windswept steppes they called home. And we, the inhabitants of Persepolis, were caught directly in their path. This wasn't a war for territory or riches. It was a struggle for survival. And as the shadows lengthened across the city, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the Scythian whisper had become a roar, and the storm was about to break. Abydos. A sea of bronze and linen. It stretched as far as the eye could see, a shimmering wave of humanity crashing against the shores of the Hellespont. Rank upon rank of soldiers, their spears bristling like a metallic forest, filled the air with the clang and clatter of weaponry. Chariots, their wheels caked in dust from the long march, rumbled past, drawn by nervous horses snorting plumes of white breath. The air crackled with a strange energy, a heady cocktail of anticipation, dread, and the pungent aroma of unwashed men. Engineers, their faces streaked with sweat and grime, swarmed like ants over the colossal pontoon bridge snaking its way across the churning waters. Logistical nightmare, some whispered. A feat of engineering genius, others countered. Personally, I thought it looked like a particularly ambitious beaver dam, and about as stable. The whole construction creaked and groaned with every added man and beast, a testament to the sheer weight of the Persian army. Turns out, herding cats is easier than herding Persian aristocrats onto a floating platform. Half of them seemed more concerned with polishing their breastplates than with not plunging into the Hellespont. Historians still debate the motivations of the men who marched with Darius. Glory? Plunder? A deeply ingrained sense of patriotic duty? I wasn't privy to the inner workings of their minds, but I could hazard a guess that most of them would rather be anywhere else. Me? I was fairly certain I'd rather be back in Persepolis, haggling with that venomous olive merchant. At least his insults were predictable. This was chaos. The crossing began. And chaos didn't even begin to cover it. It was a chaotic ballet of men, horses, and chariots jostling for space on the swaying bridge. The pontoons bobbed and dipped precariously with every surge of the current, sending ripples of panic through the ranks. I'd heard tales of Darius whipping the Hellespont when a storm wrecked his first attempt at bridging the strait. Anger management issues, anyone? Looking at the current state of affairs, I could almost sympathize. The bridge groaned under the weight, a low, ominous sound that resonated deep in my bones. I was fairly certain this entire operation was about to sink faster than a lead sandal in the Aegean Sea. Belong, my ever-optimistic, or perhaps just morbidly fascinated companion, put down 2 silver drachmas on less than a week for the bridge's survival. I considered taking the bet, but decided against it. Frankly, I wasn't sure I'd be around to collect if he won. My camel, burdened with my diplomatic pouch and what felt like the entire contents of a Persepolitan bazaar, shuffled nervously on the swaying platform. He kept giving me these sideways glances, his large, expressive eyes filled with a mixture of reproach, and what I could only interpret as a strong desire to jump ship. "Just jump, dude," his gaze seemed to say. "The water's probably cleaner than this bridge." I considered it. The crossing seemed to stretch on for an eternity. The rhythmic creaking of the bridge, the shouts of the soldiers, the snorting of the horses, it all blended into a cacophony of sound that pressed against my eardrums. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air thick and oppressive. The smell of sweat, fear, and, well, let's just say the sanitary conditions were less than ideal, hung heavy in the air. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, we reached the other side. The Thracian plain stretched before us, a vast expanse of green and brown under the pale sky. The Persian army, a disheveled mass of warriors, spilled onto the land like a tide of bronze and linen, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and apprehension. We had crossed the Hellespont. We had entered Europe. My journey into the unknown had officially begun. You trudge north, following a supply train that seems to stretch from Persepolis to the polar ice caps. Seriously, Darius must have packed his entire wardrobe just in case the Scythians have a formal skull cup ceremony. What else could explain the sheer volume of carts, wagons, pack animals, and chattering servants? The landscape of Thrace unfurls before you, a tapestry of rolling hills and dense forests, a terrain surprisingly similar to certain parts of Persia, minus, the impending doom. Historians still argue whether Darius's logistical planning was impressive or insane. You're leaning towards the latter. How do you even begin to feed and water this monstrous caravan, let alone maneuver it across rivers and through who knows what kind of Scythian wilderness? It's a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. As you march, you pass Thracian villages, clusters of mud brick houses nestled amongst the trees. Their inhabitants peer cautiously from behind the walls, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. You've heard whispers, rumors of strange Thracian customs, ritualistic self-mutilation, for example. Okay, maybe the scorpion tattoos aren't so bad after all. At least they're not self-inflicted. Children gawk openly, pointing and whispering amongst themselves. Adults offer cautious greetings, a mix of Thracian dialects you can't understand but interpret as something along the lines of, "Welcome, invaders. Please don't burn down our village." Dogs bark, a cacophony of sound that follows the army like a welcoming committee from Hades. The sheer boredom of the march is starting to wear you down. You're seriously tempted to desert, join a Thracian circus, and learn the art of fire eating. Anything, absolutely anything, but going further into Scythia. The thought of facing horse-riding, skull-cup-wielding barbarians is considerably less appealing than juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle. Your camel, however, is clearly unimpressed by your internal debate. He's seen worse commutes. That Hellespont bridge, for instance. He gives a weary sigh, shifts his weight, and plods onward, his hooves kicking up dust that coats your already grimy tunic. Speaking of discomfort, your bladder, again, disagrees with the pace of this forced march. There's a distinct lack of convenient shrubbery, and the thought of asking permission to relieve yourself in a Thracian village, with all those curious eyes watching, fills you with a special kind of dread. The march drags on, a monotonous parade of dust and dysentery. The scenery changes little, the sun beats down relentlessly, and the constant rumble of the supply train grates on your nerves. You're starting to miss the relative comforts of home, even your wife's skull-cup remarriage threats. At least there was some passion in those. Here there's only the endless, soul-crushing monotony of the march. The days blur into one another, an indistinguishable stream of aching muscles, empty stomachs, and the ever-present dust. You lose track of time, measuring your progress not by hours or days, but by the number of blisters on your feet and the dwindling supply of dried dates in your pack. The Thracian landscape, once intriguing, now seems oppressive. The endless hills and forests mocking your slow progress. You try to engage in conversation with your fellow soldiers, but their spirits are as low as yours. The initial excitement of the campaign has long since evaporated, replaced by a grim determination to survive. Even the usual boisterous boasts and crude jokes have dwindled to a minimum. The nights are marginally better, offering a brief respite from the relentless sun and the dust. You huddle around small fires, sharing meager rations and swapping stories to keep your spirits up. But even then, the fear of the unknown hangs heavy in the air. Scythia looms ahead, a vast and mysterious land, and the stories of its fierce inhabitants fuel your anxieties. You try to imagine what awaits you beyond the Thracian border, but your imagination can conjure up only images of savage warriors, desolate steppes, and, of course, those infamous skull cups. You shiver, pull your cloak tighter around you, and stare into the flames, praying to any god who will listen for a swift and merciful end to this ill-fated expedition. Or at least, a decent latrine. The Danube. Wide. Muddy. Snaking across the vast plain like a giant, particularly sluggish earthworm, we'd marched for what felt like an eternity to reach this obstacle. Obstacle being a polite term for a river that looked like it could swallow an entire army and still have room for a light snack of cavalry afterwards. And, wouldn't you know it, our solution was staring us in the face. More boats. Lots and lots of boats. Lashed together, bobbing precariously. Destined to become yet another pontoon bridge. The same engineers who, miraculously, hadn't completely lost their minds after the Hellespont fiasco were back at it. You're convinced these guys have stock in pontoon companies. Seriously, they're practically giddy. I overheard one humming a jaunty little tune while hammering planks together. Probably the company jingle. Historians, in their infinite wisdom, still debate whether this Danube crossing was easier or harder than the Hellespont. Me? I'm just wondering if there's any chance I can get a transfer to the supply corps. I hear the royal sock drawer needs guarding. It sounds positively thrilling compared to this. At least the socks won't try to drown you. The bridge, log by agonizing log, began to stretch across the muddy expanse. Each creak and groan of the timbers echoed the growing unease in my gut. Then they appeared. On the far bank, shadowy figures materialized against the bleak horizon. Scythian scouts. Mounted on wiry ponies, they were barely more than silhouettes, but their presence was heavy, oppressive. We could feel their eyes on us, assessing, calculating. Quirky little fact about Scythians. Supposedly, they communicate using a system of whistles and hand signals. So while they observed our bridge-building efforts with unsettling intensity, they were probably having a silent conversation about our chances of survival. I imagined it went something like this. Whistle, whistle, chirp. Hand gesture resembling a drowning man. Chirp, whistle. Comforting. They didn't attack, not yet. Just watched. Like vultures circling a dying camel. Possibly mine. I even waved cheerfully, hoping they might, offer me asylum. A nice yurt. Maybe a few lessons in whistling etiquette. No such luck. Then, as quickly as they'd appeared, they vanished. Melted away into the landscape. The silence that followed was even more unsettling than their watchful presence. It felt like the calm before a particularly nasty storm. The kind of storm that involves arrows, screaming, and possibly skull cups. You're starting to think those Scythian skull cups might come with a free disappearance potion. Every log added to the bridge felt like another step toward the unknown, toward a land rumored to be populated by fierce warriors and even fiercer mosquitoes. With every hammer blow, the gap between us and the Scythian-held territory narrowed. And with it, the gap between me and a potential panic attack narrowed too. We were crossing the point of no return, literally and figuratively. The Hellespont had been bad, a test of endurance and engineering. But this felt different. This felt like walking into the lion's den, armed with nothing but a rusty spear and a rapidly diminishing supply of optimism. The Danube, once just a wide, muddy river, had become a symbolic barrier between the known world and, well, whatever lay beyond. And judging by the ominous silence emanating from the far bank, whatever lay beyond probably wasn't a welcoming committee with pastries and complimentary mead. The world opened up. Gone were the claustrophobic Thracian forests, the damp earth and tangled undergrowth. Here, beneath a sky so vast, it felt like it might swallow you whole, stretched Scythia. Grassland, endless grassland, rippling in the wind like a green ocean. The occasional copse of trees or the conical shape of a nomadic tent punctuated the monotony, but otherwise, it was just space. So much space. After weeks in the Thracian woods, this openness felt unsettling, exposing, vulnerable. Historians still debate whether the army's morale was high or low at this point in the campaign. Mine, currently locked in a desperate struggle with a dung beetle for the lowest point in the valley, was clearly not winning. We marched on, the rhythmic thud of thousands of feet a dull counterpoint to the whistling wind. Then they appeared. Scythian horsemen, not in formed ranks or organized units, but small, scattered groups. They materialized on the flanks, harassing us with swift raids, then melting back into the landscape, as ephemeral as desert mirages. I'd heard tales, whispers really, about their customs. Supposedly, they drank the blood of their first kill in battle. Okay, that's one hospitality ritual I'll politely decline. I started practicing my best. I'm just a humble herald, here to take notes and admire your excellent horsemanship impression. I hoped they valued diplomatic immunity, or at least decent calligraphy. Their tactics were infuriating, a war of attrition, not of conquest, a constant, nagging pressure, designed to wear us down, to chip away at our supplies and our sanity. Darius's more gold, more problem strategy seemed to be backfiring spectacularly. I trudged on, the dust clinging to my sweat-soaked tunic. wondering if my camel had a return ticket to Persepolis for both of us. Days bled into one another, each marked by the same frustrating dance. Advance. Retreat. The whisper of arrows, the sting of Scythian taunts flung in a language I didn't understand. I could only assume they involved creative insults about my ancestry, my sandals, and my general lack of horse-riding prowess. The water skins grew lighter, my patience thinner. I seriously contemplated trading my camel for a fast horse and making a run for the nearest border. Any border. The only thing stopping me, ironically, was my bladder. Turns out, dehydration trumps terror. Who knew? The steppes stretched on, a vast, empty battlefield where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the sky a blinding metallic blue. The wind, once a refreshing breeze, now felt like a hot, dry hand across my face. Dust devils danced across the plains, mocking our slow, plodding progress. I squinted at the horizon, hoping for some sign, any sign of change in the landscape. A hill, a river, anything other than this endless expanse of grass. But there was nothing. Just the steppes, stretching on, like a green sea under a merciless sky. This, I realized with a sinking heart, was going to be a long campaign. Very long. The Scythians, masters of their terrain, were like phantoms, always present, yet never truly tangible. Their arrows, tipped with bone or bronze, whistled past our ears, a constant reminder of their presence. They'd appear suddenly, a whirlwind of horses and shouting men, harass our flanks, then vanish as quickly as they'd come, leaving a trail of dust and anxiety in their wake. Their horses, smaller and stockier than our Persian steeds, were incredibly agile, able to turn and maneuver with breathtaking speed. They seemed to be part of the very landscape, extensions of the wind and the grass. The nights offered little respite. The temperature plummeted, the wind howled across the plains, and the vastness of the sky, once awe-inspiring, now felt oppressive, filled with an infinite, chilling emptiness. Sleep was fitful and punctuated by nightmares of endless grasslands and whispering arrows. We huddled around meager fires, rationing our dwindling supplies, and listening to the whispers of fear and uncertainty that spread through the camp like the wind through the dry grass. I began to understand the Scythian strategy. They weren't trying to defeat us in a single, decisive battle. They were aiming to break us, to erode our morale, to whittle us down until we were nothing more than a ragged, demoralized remnant of the mighty Persian army. And they were succeeding. The constant harassment, the lack of water, the sheer, relentless monotony of the landscape, it was all taking its toll. The faces of the men around me were grim, their eyes hollow. Even the bravest amongst us were starting to show signs of strain. The jokes and laughter that had once punctuated our marches were gone, replaced by a sullen silence. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks seemed to stretch into an eternity. The landscape remained unchanged, a vast, empty canvas upon which the Scythians painted their masterpiece of guerrilla warfare. I continued to chronicle the events, my hand cramping as I scribbled on my increasingly worn papyrus scrolls. I wrote of the endless grasslands, the relentless wind, the phantom-like Scythian horsemen, and the growing despair that was slowly but surely engulfing the Persian army. I wrote, not just as a scribe, but as a witness, a chronicler of a campaign that seemed destined to end not in glorious victory, but in slow, agonizing defeat. The Scythian welcome wagon, it turned out, was a chariot ride straight to hell. After weeks of marching through what feels like the world's largest sandbox, you finally see it, a large Scythian city shimmering in the distance. It looks impressive, almost crassive, like a mirage conjured by the sun and your desperate craving for something other than dust and camel spit. Historians still argue whether this city was a trap or a genuine opportunity for conquest. You're betting on the former. The army approaches cautiously, arranging themselves in a defensive formation, scouts probing ahead, because those Scythian skull cups aren't going to fill themselves. Hopefully not with your skull. You polish your official herald's staff, hoping it doubles as a decent self-defense weapon. The scouts return, their expressions troubled. The city is abandoned, empty, a ghost town. Scythians supposedly practiced divination using animal entrails, which, you know what, you're starting to respect their commitment to unconventional methods. You check for tripwires and hidden scorpion nests, because trust no one, especially not an empty city. Your camel surprisingly looks disappointed. He was looking forward to some city amenities, possibly a camel spa. Your bladder, again, heartily agrees. You enter the deserted city, a maze of empty streets and abandoned tents. The silence is deafening. Or maybe that's just the accumulated camel dung blocking your ear canals. You find evidence of recent occupation, dying embers in fire pits, discarded tools, half-eaten hunks of horse meat. Yum? The air hangs heavy with an unsettling quiet. This isn't a victory, it's a warning. The Scythians are not conquered, they've simply vanished. You trudge through the empty city, the silence amplifying the crunch of your sandals on the dry earth. The tents, once vibrant homes, now flap listlessly in the breeze like forgotten laundry. The wind whispers through the empty spaces, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and something else, something acrid and unfamiliar. It clings to the back of your throat, a ghostly reminder of the people who were here just hours, maybe days ago. You stoop to examine a discarded tool, a finely crafted bone awl, still sharp enough to pierce leather. The craftsmanship is impressive, a testament to the Scythians' skill and ingenuity. It makes their disappearance all the more perplexing. Where could an entire population vanish to so quickly, leaving behind such evidence of their recent presence? The desert stretches out in all directions, a vast, unforgiving expanse. Where could they have gone that would offer more safety, more sustenance than this, their established home? The thought sends a shiver down your spine. This wasn't the triumphant entry you'd imagined. You pictured clashing swords, the roar of battle, the satisfying thud of enemy standards falling to the dust. Not this eerie stillness, this unsettling absence. You were supposed to be a conqueror, a hero, adding another jewel to the empire's crown. Instead, you feel like an intruder, trespassing on sacred ground. You glance back at your men, their faces mirroring your own unease. They shift nervously, their hands gripping their weapons, eyes darting around as if expecting an ambush from the shadows. Even the camels seem unsettled, their soft grunts echoing strangely in the silence. Further into the city you find a larger tent, presumably belonging to a person of importance. Inside, a low table is overturned, scattering beads and small carved figurines across the floor. A half-finished piece of embroidery lies draped across a stool, the needle still threaded. It depicts a scene of warriors on horseback, hunting deer under a crimson sun. The detail is exquisite, the colors vibrant, capturing a moment of life frozen in time. You pick up a small, carved wooden horse, its mane intricately detailed. It fits perfectly in the palm of your hand, smooth and worn from handling. It's a child's toy. The realization strikes you with unexpected force. These weren't just warriors, fierce nomads with a reputation for brutality. They were families, individuals, children who played with wooden horses, and mothers who stitched scenes of everyday life. They were people who lived, laughed, and loved, just like you. The weight of their absence presses down on you, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't a victory. It was a mystery, a chilling testament to the power of the desert, and the resilience, or perhaps desperation, of the people who called it home. The Scythians were gone, vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers in the wind and the unsettling echo of their absence. This wasn't how you imagined a military triumph. It wasn't even a decent bedtime story. It was a warning. A silent, unsettling warning etched in the empty streets and abandoned tents of a ghost city. And as you stood there, surrounded by the remnants of their lives, you couldn't shake the feeling that you were not a conqueror, but a witness. A witness to something ancient, something powerful, and something deeply, deeply unsettling. The desert had swallowed them whole, and you, standing amidst the silence, felt a prickle of fear, a premonition that the same unforgiving landscape might one day swallow you too. Your camel nudges your arm, his large brown eyes looking at you expectantly. He lets out a soft groan, a reminder of his, and your, increasingly urgent need for relief. You look around the desolate city, the emptiness pressing in on you. The silence whispers secrets you can't understand. You sigh. This wasn't the conquest you'd envisioned. This wasn't the glory you'd craved. This was something else entirely. Something far more unsettling. And you, herald of the empire, conqueror of nothing, were left standing in the dust, wondering what had happened, and where, in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the desert, they had gone. Darius's roar echoed through the empty streets of the Scythian city, a sound more befitting a wounded lion than the King of Kings. He'd been promised gold, slaves, and glory. He'd gotten dust, silence, and a growing suspicion that his meticulously crafted royal beard was starting to itch. With a final, guttural yell, he kicked a large bronze cauldron, sending it rolling across the deserted square. The hollow clang seemed to mock his frustration. "The bridge!" "It was the bridge!" he bellowed, his face turning the color of a pomegranate. "Those incompetent engineers! If it hadn't taken so long to build, we would have caught them." I bit back a sigh. Blaming the engineers had become his favorite pastime. It was easier than admitting that maybe, just maybe, the Scythians had outmaneuvered him. Again. I briefly considered offering him my camel, along with a little note. "Enjoy your ride back to Persepolis." I imagined the look on his face, a mixture of outrage and bewilderment, and stifled a chuckle. It wouldn't be wise to test the limits of royal patience, especially when said royalty was currently channeling the wrath of Ahura Mazda. "Sacrifices!" Darius declared, his voice booming. "We must appease the gods. They are displeased with us." Of course, his sacrifice wouldn't be involved. Probably a few goats, maybe a sheep or two. Nothing too extravagant. Certainly not a king. Historians will argue for centuries whether Darius's rage was justified or just a case of extreme royal entitlement. Me? I'm putting my money on the unicorn withdrawal. The man had a serious craving for those mythical beasts. I trudged back through the empty city, my sandals kicking up dust devils in the deserted streets. I was still hoping to find something, anything of value. A chest of gold. A cache of jewels. Or maybe, just maybe, a working compass. The Scythians, it seemed, had packed light. I'd heard rumors that they used some kind of hemp-based smoke for ritual purification and relaxation. Suddenly, that sounded incredibly appealing. Then, tucked inside a discarded tent, I saw it. A small clay tablet, partially hidden beneath a pile of furs. It was covered in cuneiform writing. Cuneiform? Here? That was odd. Wasn't that Mesopotamian? I squinted at the markings, half expecting it to be a secret treasure map, or the Scythian version of takeout menus. It wasn't either. Holding the tablet carefully, I realized it was a message, not from me, but from a Scythian mother to her son. I couldn't decipher the specific words, but the tone resonated with surprising clarity. It wasn't a battle plan or a curse. It was a message of love, of reassurance, sprinkled with warnings about staying safe and keeping warm. This city wasn't a trap. It was a temporary home, and they would be back. The realization sent a chill down my spine. We weren't conquerors. We were intruders, and the owners of this land were watching, waiting. The army spent the next few days in the deserted city, a strange parody of occupation. Soldiers foraged for whatever scraps of food they could find, replenishing their dwindling water supplies from the nearby river. Darius, meanwhile, continued to stew in his anger like a pot of spoiled milk. He paced, he grumbled, he blamed everyone but himself. It was exhausting to watch. I thought about sending another message to my wife. I needed to update the Skull Cup contingency plan. And maybe request new instructions. If I don't return, I imagined writing, sell the camel. He's seen better days. The silence of the city was oppressive, broken only by the occasional, distant sound of a Scythian whistle. A taunt, a warning, a reminder that we were surrounded by unseen eyes, or the wind whistling through the empty tents. A mournful song for a life that had been abruptly uprooted. This wasn't conquest. It was a waiting game, and I wasn't sure what we were waiting for. Victory felt like a distant dream, defeat a looming shadow. All I knew for certain was that the Scythians were out there, somewhere beyond the horizon, and they weren't gone. They were simply waiting for their moment. And that, more than anything, filled me with a deep sense of unease. The dust devils danced across the barren steppe, swirling up the dry earth and flinging it into our faces as we marched further east. The Scythian trail was easy enough to follow. A breadcrumb trail of abandoned campsites, discarded cooking fires, and the occasional bewildered goat, seemingly left behind in the hasty retreat. It was starting to feel less like a military campaign and more like following a particularly disorganized mobile yard sale, one specifically designed to irritate Darius's well-known hoarding tendencies. I imagined him back in Persepolis, fuming at the thought of all that perfectly good loot going unclaimed. The landscape, if you could call it that, was relentlessly monotonous. An ocean of grass, stretching to the horizon, unbroken by anything taller than a particularly ambitious weed. The historians, bless their scholarly hearts, still debate whether Darius had any sort of grand strategy at this point. Personally, I suspected his strategy consisted primarily of stubbornness, a hefty dose of royal entitlement, and perhaps a pinch of, "I've come this far, might as well keep going." The Scythian horsemen, those pesky shadows on the horizon, were becoming more numerous. They flitted around our flanks like irritating flies, never quite landing, always just out of reach. I'd heard tales of Scythian women fighting alongside the men, a rumor that, if true, might explain their surprisingly toned triceps. They weren't engaging directly, not yet, but the harassment was intensifying. Arrows, launched from seemingly nowhere, would find gaps in our defenses, thudding into shields or, less fortunately, into unfortunate soldiers. At night, their whistles echoed through the darkness, ghostly whispers that did little for the morale, or for my already fragile sleep. I'd even taken up meditation, hoping to achieve a state of zen-like detachment from my impending doom. So far, the only thing I'd achieved was a crick in my neck. Our supply train, already stretched thin, was groaning under the strain of this pointless pursuit. Rations were dwindling, tempers were fraying, and the camels, bless their hairy humps, were starting to look distinctly mutinous. My own camel, Bartholomew, was developing a pronounced limp and 1,000-yard stare, leading me to suspect he was contemplating retirement, possibly to a camel monastery in the mountains, where he could spend his days meditating on the futility of war and the merits of a good thistle patch. My bladder, nearing its breaking point after hours of marching, was starting to sympathize with Bartholomew's world-weariness. The wind, that tireless gossip of the steppes, carried rumors of other Persian forces encountering similar frustrations. Empty cities, abandoned villages, skirmishes that never quite escalated into battles. The Scythians seemed to be experts at the art of non-engagement. I was starting to develop a sneaking suspicion that the entire Scythian invasion force was playing an elaborate game of hide-and-seek, just to troll Darius. Imagine the scene. A bunch of Scythian warriors, huddled around a campfire, roaring with laughter as they imagined the mighty Persian king chasing shadows across the steppe. The pursuit dragged on, a pointless game of cat and mouse where the mouse was surprisingly adept at disappearing into thin air. Or, more accurately, thick grass. Each day was a repetition of the last. March, squint at the horizon, curse the dust, swat at flies, dodge the occasional arrow, and wonder if Darius planned to conquer Scythia one abandoned tent at a time. We trudged on, our sandals grinding into the dry earth, each step a testament to the stubbornness of our king and the resilience of the human bladder. The sun beat down mercilessly, the wind whispered its secrets, and the steppe stretched on, an endless expanse of grass and dust and the faint, haunting whistles of our elusive enemy. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing Bartholomew in his mountain monastery, sipping herbal tea and contemplating the meaning of life. Suddenly, retirement didn't seem like such a bad idea. The once fertile farmland stretched before the Persian army like a vast blackened scar. Where golden wheat fields had swayed, now only charred stalks remained. Villages stood, abandoned, hollowed out husks against the smoke-filled sky. Even the wells, lifelines in this arid land, had been poisoned, rendering them useless. Darius's gold more problem strategy has officially evolved into no gold, all problems. Historians might debate the effectiveness of the Scythians' scorched earth policy, attributing it to strategic brilliance or pure spite. You're personally leaning towards a healthy dose of both. After all, burning everything in your path isn't exactly subtle, but it definitely sends a message. We trudged through the charred fields, the acrid smell of smoke and defeat thick in the air. Each step crunched on the brittle remains of what had once been life-giving crops. The Scythians, it was said, believed in an afterlife where warriors feasted and rode eternally. Suddenly that sounded infinitely more appealing than being a royal herald stuck in a burned-out farm, choking on ash and despair. My camel, Cyrus, coughed raggedly beside me, his large, expressive eyes fixed on me with a familiar blend of reproach and resignation. He was clearly judging my life choices. Again. I sighed and shared some of my dwindling water supply with him, hoping to delay his inevitable retirement and consequently mine. The supply situation was becoming increasingly dire. Rations were running dangerously low. Whispers circulated through the camp of soldiers going days without a proper meal. Rumor had it that even the royal sock drawer was facing shortages. Darius, I imagine, would gladly trade his embroidered trousers, perhaps even his crown, for a decent meal and a reliable map. A therapist might also be high on his list of desired commodities at this point. The Scythian horsemen, like shadows in the smoke-hazed distance, continued their relentless harassment. Their tactics had evolved from mere harassment to carefully planned ambushes. Small groups would strike at isolated units, melting back into the vast steppes before reinforcements could arrive. The army's morale, already fragile, had officially gone AWOL, deserting faster than I dream of doing on a nightly basis. The constant pressure, the dwindling supplies, the ever-present smell of smoke. It was all taking its toll. I'm starting to think a Scythian skull cup might be a step up from my current job description. At least it would be a change of pace. The march dragged on, a relentless descent into frustration and hunger. The sun beat down mercilessly on the scorched earth, baking the already parched land. The silence, broken only by the occasional cough of a weary soldier or the distant whinny of a Scythian horse, was almost as oppressive as the smoke. Each day felt like an eternity, a slow, agonizing crawl across a landscape of despair. The soldiers, once proud and disciplined, now shuffled along, their faces etched with exhaustion and disillusionment. The glorious Persian army, once the envy of the known world, was now a shadow of its former self, reduced to a ragged band of starving, demoralized men, stumbling through a desolate wasteland. The nights offered little respite. The chilling desert air replaced the scorching sun, and the fear of Scythian raids kept everyone on edge. Sleep was a luxury few could afford. Instead, we huddled around meager fires, sharing stories and rumors, clinging to any shred of hope we could find. The stories, often exaggerated tales of past glories and heroic deeds, were a desperate attempt to remind ourselves of who we once were, of what we were fighting for. But even the stories were tinged with a growing sense of despair, a realization that the glorious past was fading into a distant memory, replaced by the harsh reality of the present. The landscape itself seemed to reflect our dwindling spirits. The blackened earth stretched out in all directions, a stark reminder of the destruction we had wrought and the destruction that had been wrought upon us. The skeletal remains of burned trees clawed at the smoke-filled sky like ghostly fingers reaching out in silent accusation. Even the wind, which once carried the scent of fertile fields and blooming flowers, now whispered tales of defeat and despair. I found myself increasingly drawn to Cyrus, my camel companion. His stoic nature, his unwavering patience, offered a strange comfort in the midst of the chaos. He, at least, seemed unfazed by the hardships we faced. Perhaps, I thought, he had the right idea. Perhaps the key to survival in this desolate land was not to fight against the inevitable, but to accept it with quiet dignity. As the days bled into weeks, the line between reality and nightmare blurred. The constant hunger, the relentless fatigue, the ever-present fear, it all began to take its toll on my sanity. I found myself questioning everything, doubting everything. Was this march to conquest worth the cost? Was Darius's ambition worth the suffering of so many? Was my own life, my own future, worth sacrificing for a cause that seemed increasingly lost? The answer, I feared, was blowing in the wind, carried on the smoke-filled air, whispered by the ghosts of the burned-out fields. And the answer, I suspected, was a resounding no. Darius, the self-proclaimed king of kings, finally faced a reality more daunting than any Scythian arrow. An empty stomach. The grand Persian war machine, designed to crush empires, was sputtering to a halt, fueled not by glorious conquest, but by the gnawing pangs of hunger. With a face as sour as fermented mare's milk, he announced the retreat, a decision delivered with all the grace of a constipated camel. The blame, naturally, fell on everyone but the brilliant strategist himself. The generals were incompetent, the soldiers lacked courage, the terrain was unfairly uneven, and the Scythian tactics, well, they were just downright unsporting. He railed against the heavens, promising divine retribution upon the elusive nomads. And, in a final flourish of impotent rage, he vowed to return with a larger army, a threat that echoed hollowly across the barren steppe. My camel, bless his furry heart, let out a sound that could only be interpreted as derisive laughter. I, ever the helpful scribe, offered my services in crafting the "We'll be back" proclamation, secretly hoping to include a small disclaimer regarding Skull Cup contingencies and the availability of suitable catering next time. Historians, I've learned, love to debate the nuances of ancient military strategy, arguing whether Darius's retreat was a calculated maneuver or a desperate scramble for survival. My own stomach, screaming for sustenance, was less concerned with such scholarly debates and more focused on the immediate problem of not expiring from starvation. The great Persian army, once a majestic force, turned south, a disheveled mass of tired men and overworked camels. We resembled less a conquering horde and more a troop of itinerant beggars, our once gleaming armor now dull and dusty, our proud banners tattered and drooping. We trudged back towards the Danube, each step a testament to our collective misery. The Scythians, bless their resourceful little hearts, had developed a rather morbid tradition of burying their kings with their horses, servants, and wives. It made my wife's threats of remarriage should I fail to return seem positively mild by comparison. At least she wasn't planning on taking my favorite camel with her to the afterlife. The retreat was slow, agonizingly so. Dwindling supplies and the ever-present Scythian horsemen hampered our progress. They continued to harass our flanks like a swarm of particularly persistent mosquitoes, nipping at our heels, stealing our meager provisions, and generally making life miserable. I spent a considerable amount of time practicing my camel whispering skills, hoping to convince my trusty mount to break the sound barrier and leave our pursuers in the dust. My sandals were worn through, my robes ripped, and my dignity, well, let's just say it was a distant memory. This wasn't a retreat. It was a strategic shamble, a slow-motion collapse of imperial ambition in the face of an empty larder and some seriously irritating horse archers. The days blurred into one long, uncomfortable trek. The sun beat down mercilessly. The wind whipped across the desolate landscape, and the dust. Oh, the dust. It coated everything, a fine layer of gritty misery that found its way into our eyes, our noses, our mouths, and even, I suspected, our very souls. The once boastful Persian soldiers, now reduced to scavenging for scraps, grumbled amongst themselves. Their complaints ranged from the lack of decent wine, a valid point I must admit, to the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements. Sleeping on the ground tends to lose its appeal after the first few weeks, to the general unfairness of it all. Why us, they'd moan. Why couldn't we have invaded somewhere civilized with proper taverns and soft beds? I couldn't help but sympathize. Even I, a humble scribe, yearned for the comforts of home, for a hot bath, a decent meal, and a scroll that didn't require constant dusting. The Scythians, meanwhile, seemed to be having the time of their lives. They danced around our retreating columns, their laughter echoing across the plains. They were like mischievous spirits, appearing and disappearing at will, their arrows a constant reminder of their presence. I started to develop a grudging respect for their tactics. They were masters of harassment, experts at making life unpleasant without ever engaging in a full-scale battle. It was a frustratingly effective strategy, like being perpetually poked by a very skilled, very annoying child. The Danube, our blessed escape route, seemed to recede further with each passing day. Hope, like our supplies, was dwindling. The soldiers' morale was lower than a snake's belly in a rut. Even Darius, the great king, had lost some of his swagger. He rode in sullen silence, his face etched with a mixture of frustration and indigestion. I suspect even he was starting to realize that his grand invasion hadn't quite gone according to plan. One evening, as we huddled around a meager fire, trying to coax some warmth from the damp wood, I overheard a conversation between two soldiers. "Do you think we'll ever see Persia again?" one asked, his voice filled with despair. "Only if we learn to fly," the other replied, gesturing towards the endless expanse of the steppe. It was a bleak assessment, but not entirely inaccurate. We were stranded in a hostile land, miles from home, with an army that was rapidly falling apart. Our situation, to put it mildly, was precarious. I sighed, took a bite of my stale bread, or whatever that gritty substance was supposed to be, and offered a silent prayer to any god who might be listening. A prayer for safe passage, for a full stomach, and for the swift return of my dignity, which I suspected had long since deserted me. It was probably now enjoying a leisurely vacation in some far-off oasis. This was a turning point, all right. A turning point towards utter disaster, and all I could think about was a hot bath and a decent plate of lamb. Maybe next time, Darius would consider conquering a land known for its hospitality and culinary delights, rather than this dusty, wind-swept wasteland. My camel, at least, seemed to agree with my sentiment. He let out another rumbling sigh, a sound that resonated with my own weariness and longing for home. And just maybe, a hint of amusement at the sheer absurdity of it all. Joke 3/3. You start taking bets on how long it will take Darius to blame the camels for the failed invasion. The dust devils danced mockingly across the barren landscape, swirling up the misery of the past weeks. Each step was a leaden weight, each breath a rasping reminder of the relentless sun and dwindling rations. The retreat dragged on, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, or perhaps just stubbornness. Darius had lost a significant portion of his army during this ill-fated Scythian campaign, a fact whispered among the ranks with a mixture of fear and grim satisfaction. I'm convinced my camel has lost more weight than Darius's ego, which is saying something. That ego, however, seemed to be the only thing thriving in this wasteland. The army's morale had sunk lower than a Scythian latrine, and rumors of mutiny whispered through the ranks like the ever-present desert winds. Historians still argue whether Darius's leadership was effective during the retreat. From my vantage point, nestled somewhere between a snoring soldier and a pile of camel dung, his primary leadership skill seemed to be blaming others. The Scythians, the terrain, the weather, even the gods themselves, all were apparently culpable, except, of course, the great king himself. We passed through Thracian villages again, a stark contrast to our earlier passage. Then, we had been conquerors, full of swagger and arrogance. Now we were the tired, dusty remnants of a failed invasion, shuffling through their lands like ghosts. Thracians, I'd learned, supposedly believed in reincarnation. It gave me an idea for my next career move, possibly a Thracian goat herder. Seemed like a peaceful existence. I even started practicing my goat-calling skills, just in case. The Thracians, less cautious now that we posed no threat, offered cautious pity rather than cautious greetings. I could have sworn their dogs were laughing at us. My camel, bless its long-suffering heart, still trudged dutifully onward, now acting as my life coach. Motivational speeches came in the form of deep sighs and meaningful glances, mostly in the direction of the border. My bladder, now a dried husk of its former self, had given up hope, possibly along with my liver. The days blurred into weeks, each sunrise bringing the same monotonous routine: walk, sweat, curse, conserve water, repeat. The landscape changed subtly, the endless plains gradually giving way to rolling hills, a sign that the Danube, and hopefully salvation, was drawing closer. The air grew cooler, a welcome change from the scorching desert heat, but it also carried a different kind of chill, the chill of uncertainty. Finally, as we neared the Danube, the relentless Scythian horsemen disengaged. I imagined them riding off into the sunset, whooping and hollering, satisfied they'd sufficiently trolled Darius and his imperial ambitions. I waved goodbye, secretly wishing them well, and possibly a subscription to Asterix Anger Management Monthly. Reaching the Danube felt like stumbling upon an oasis in the desert. Though the river itself was a muddy, unimpressive thing, still it represented a boundary, a line between the folly that lay behind us and the uncertain journey that still lay ahead. The muddy current seemed to swirl with the ghosts of lost hopes and shattered dreams. This wasn't just a retreat. It was a test of endurance, a trial by fire, well, you get the idea, and I wasn't entirely sure I'd pass. The sight of the boats, hastily constructed but sturdy enough, waiting to ferry us across the river, was a bittersweet one. Relief warred with exhaustion, the desire to escape with the lingering shame of defeat. As I limped towards the riverbank, my camel trailing behind me like a furry, four-legged shadow, I couldn't help but wonder what awaited us on the other side. Would Darius learn from this disastrous campaign? Highly doubtful. Would I ever feel clean again? Less doubtful, but still a long shot. Would my camel ever forgive me for the things I'd said to it during the darkest hours of the retreat? Probably not. But as I stepped onto the boat, the current pulling us away from the hostile shores of Scythia, I allowed myself a sliver of hope. We had survived. For now, that was enough. The future, like the Danube itself, remained murky and uncertain, but at least we were moving forward, and that I realized, was the only thing that truly mattered. Now, if someone could just point me in the direction of the nearest bathhouse, and maybe a decent tavern. The Danube. Again. I swear, that river has a personal vendetta against me. It's wider, muddier, and somehow even more intimidating than when we first crossed it, bloated with the tears of 1,000 retreating Persians. Yet there it was, the pontoon bridge, still miraculously spanning the churning waters. Intact. Undamaged. Possibly held together by the gods themselves, or maybe just a team of incredibly stubborn engineers who refused to admit defeat. Either way, I'm doubling down on my investment in pontoon stock. This bridge is clearly a testament to their resilience. Historians, those dusty chroniclers of the past, still debate whether the second Danube crossing was harder or easier than the first. Personally, I'm just wondering if they offer frequent bridge crosser points. Like, do I get a free chariot wash after my 10th crossing? A discount on oars? Perhaps a commemorative "I survived the Danube twice" t-shirt? We trudged across, a bedraggled, thinner, and significantly less enthusiastic army than the one that had marched into Scythia with such arrogant confidence. We weren't conquerors. We were survivors. Remnants. Stragglers, really. A living, breathing, slightly smelly testament to the folly of underestimating your enemy, especially one that refuses to engage in a proper, stand-up, civilized battle. The Scythians. Those horse-riding, arrow-slinging, milk-drinking, cheese-curdling masters of evasion. They'd given us a masterclass in guerrilla warfare, and we'd failed miserably. I have to admit, though, their cosmology is interesting. I'd overheard some of the captured Scythians talking about a 3-tiered universe connected by a world tree. 3 tiers connected by a giant tree. Now that's a creation myth with some imagination. Beats Darius's flat earth view of conquest any day of the week. The world is flat. Therefore, I must conquer it. Not exactly inspiring, is it? I spotted a particularly tall oak on the far bank, its branches reaching skyward like grasping fingers. A sudden urge to climb it overwhelmed me. Maybe, just maybe, if I got high enough, I could catch a glimpse of this fabled world tree. Or perhaps even trigger some divine intervention. A little teleportation action, maybe? Anything to get me back to Persia faster. I started scrambling up the rough bark, ignoring the protests of my aching muscles and the disapproving snorts of my camel. He just stood there, chewing his cud with a look of weary resignation as if to say, "Seriously? After everything we've been through, you want to climb a tree?" My bladder, which had shrunk to the size and texture of a dried prune during our forced march across the steppe, suddenly piped up. It whispered in a dry, raspy voice, "Get down. Now." I sighed and slid back down, accepting the wisdom of both camel and bladder. Teleportation would have to wait. For now, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the Danube and those pesky Scythians was my top priority. The landscape gradually changed as we marched away from the river. The vast, open steppe gave way to rolling hills and scattered forests. We were leaving Skye behind, not with the spoils of war, but with a newfound appreciation for the art of strategic retreat. We'd learned some valuable lessons during our time in those desolate plains. Lessons about the limits of imperial ambition, the importance of adequate supply lines, and the surprising resilience of pontoon bridges. Mostly, though, we'd learned that sometimes the best victory is the one where you manage to escape with your life and a shred of your sanity intact. We'd marched into Scythia as an army, confident and arrogant. We were leaving as a ragged band of survivors, humbled and considerably thinner. Our bellies were empty, our boots were worn, and our spirits were bruised. But we were alive. And that, in itself, felt like a victory of sorts. The air grew cooler as we moved further south. The nights were longer, and the stars seemed brighter, undimmed by the dust and smoke of the steppe. We were heading home, to Persia, to a land of warmth and comfort, of palaces and gardens, a food that didn't involve fermented mare's milk. The thought of a hot bath and a decent meal spurred us onward. We marched with a renewed sense of purpose, driven by the primal urge to survive, and the promise of a future free from the constant threat of Scythian arrows. The road ahead was long and arduous, but we had faced worse. We had crossed the Danube twice. We had survived the Scythian steppe. We could handle anything, except maybe another climb up a particularly tall tree. My bladder was still giving me the evil eye. And my camel? He was giving me the "don't even think about it" stare. I figured it was best to listen to them. After all, they'd gotten me this far, and they were probably right. Teleportation wasn't really my forte. Walking, however painful and slow, was a much surer bet. And right now, a sure bet was exactly what I needed. Plus, I really did need to find a rest stop, preferably one with no Scythians lurking nearby. Joke 3/3, I considered marking our territory just to send a message. But then I realized the Scythians probably wouldn't even notice. They'd probably just think it was a new kind of fermented dairy product. The Thracian wind bit with a familiar chill, but this time the welcome wasn't there. No cheering crowds, no fawning chieftains, just the steady trudge of weary soldiers and the mournful bleating of sheep. We were back in Thrace, a place I'd once considered a personal victory notch on my imperial bedpost. But now, it felt more like a dusty old sandal I couldn't quite throw away. The Scythian campaign, well, let's just say it hadn't exactly gone according to plan. We'd marched into those steppes expecting quick conquest, a glorious addition to the Achaemenid portfolio. And instead, we'd gotten a masterclass in guerrilla warfare, mosquito bites, and the art of strategic retreat. Strategic retreat being the polite term for running away before we all starved or got turned into pincushions by horse archers. The whole affair had left the Empire a bit winded. Like a wrestler who'd taken one too many blows to the head. Weakened, our coffers lighter, our reputation slightly tarnished. Historians, bless their dusty scrolls, still debate just how badly the Scythian debacle impacted Darius's later decisions. Did it make him more cautious? More aggressive? More prone to staring wistfully at maps of Greece while muttering about revenge? I, personally, have a different theory. It definitely affected his hair dye budget. A king can't be seen sporting gray hairs after a less-than-stellar military excursion, can he? Appearances, after all, are everything in this Game of Thrones. So here I was, back in Thrace, ostensibly to consolidate our gains, which was imperial speak for make sure things don't fall apart completely while we lick our wounds. It wasn't exactly the glorious return I'd envisioned. No triumphal arches, no parades, just the rhythmic thud of my boots on the well-worn path, the wind whistling a melancholy tune through the desolate hills. And yes, just in case things went even further south, I'd been diligently brushing up on my Thracian goat-herding skills. You never know when a good flock of goats might come in handy. A quick getaway? A source of emergency cheese? Bartering chips in a post-apocalyptic wasteland scenario? The possibilities were endless. Plus, the goats were less judgmental than my generals about the whole Scythian incident. The scenery, at least, was as breathtakingly bleak as ever. Rugged mountains clawing at the sky, windswept plains stretching to the horizon, the occasional gnarled tree clinging precariously to a rocky outcrop. It was the kind of landscape that made you ponder the meaning of existence, the futility of ambition, and the surprising versatility of goat milk. My days were filled with tedious meetings with local chieftains, each more nervous than the last. They'd seen the empire at its apex, and now they were witnessing the cracks in the facade. The confident swagger had been replaced with a slightly forced smile, the gleam of invincibility dulled by the dust of the steppes. I assured them, of course, that everything was under control, that the Scythian campaign had been a learning experience, a strategic realignment, a temporary setback. I'd even thrown in a few inspiring anecdotes about the resilience of the Achaemenid spirit, all while mentally calculating the current market value of a prime milking goat. The nights were even longer. The campfire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the faces of my men. They were tired, disillusioned, and probably wondering if their pensions would still be valid after this whole mess. I tried to maintain a facade of cheerful optimism, but the truth was, I was just as weary as they were. The Scythian campaign had taken a toll, not just on the empire, but on me personally. I'd seen too much death, too much suffering, too many lost opportunities. The weight of it all pressed down on me, heavier than any royal diadem. I found myself spending more and more time alone, staring out at the vast, indifferent landscape. The wind howled, a mournful lament that echoed the turmoil in my own soul. What had it all been for? The conquests, the glory, the endless pursuit of power? Had it all been worth the cost? The blood spilled, the lives shattered, the empires reduced to ashes? Even the goats seemed to sense my melancholy. They'd gather around me, their soft bleating a strange comfort in the desolate silence. Perhaps, I thought, there was a certain wisdom in their simple existence, They didn't worry about empires or legacies or the fickle whims of fate. They just ate, slept, and provided milk. Maybe, just maybe, there was something to be said for that kind of uncomplicated life. But the whispers of ambition were hard to ignore. The thirst for power, once tasted, was difficult to quench. The empire, wounded but not broken, still needed a strong hand at the helm. And despite the setbacks, despite the doubts, despite the nagging suspicion that I might have made a few wrong turns along the way, I knew I couldn't give up. The future of the Achaemenid Empire, the future of Persia, rested on my shoulders. And even if it meant more long marches, more sleepless nights, and more encounters with disgruntled Thracian chieftains, I would continue to carry that burden. Even if it meant perfecting my goat-herding skills along the way. Because in this uncertain world, a king needs all the allies he can get, even the four-legged bleeding kind. And who knows, maybe one day those goats would prove to be more valuable than all the gold in the royal treasury. At least they wouldn't judge my questionable strategic decisions, or my dwindling supply of hair dye. The pontoon bridge swayed beneath my sandals, a gentle rocking motion that would have been soothing under different circumstances. Right now, it just made the gnawing emptiness in my stomach churn a little more vigorously. The Hellespont. We'd made it. Across the churning, unpredictable waters, the shores of Abydos shimmered in the afternoon sun, a beacon of promised rest and, dare I dream, a decent drink. I gazed back at the seemingly endless line of soldiers still trudging across the bridge. Dust motes danced in the air, stirred up by thousands of feet. The low rumble of their passage a constant drone. These engineers, honestly, I'm beginning to think they could build a bridge across the Styx itself, given enough rope and a few choice curses. A medal isn't enough. These magnificent bastards deserve a lifetime supply of pontoons, maybe a small island dedicated solely to pontoon-based architecture. Pontoon paradise, it has a ring to it. And to think, Darius's army actually crossed back over this thing. Imagine the logistical nightmare. The sheer volume of complaining alone would have been enough to sink a trireme. Historians, of course, can't agree on whether they were celebrating their return or simply collapsed in a heap on the far shore, too exhausted to care. I'm leaning towards the latter. There's a limit to how much forced marching and lukewarm barley gruel a man can take before the celebratory spirit kind of fizzles out. Abydos. The name itself was a balm to my weary soul. Abydos meant the end of this forced migration, the blessed cessation of marching, the glorious promise of inactivity. And, more importantly, Abydos meant date wine. Not that thin, watery swill we'd been choking down for the past few weeks. Oh no, I'm talking the good stuff. Thick, syrupy, the kind that coats your tongue and leaves you feeling like you could wrestle a minotaur. I'd been fantasizing about it for days, picturing myself submerged in a vat of the stuff, just breathing in the fumes. Maybe even doing a little backstroke. The planks of the bridge groaned under the weight of a passing ox cart, jolting me back to reality. Just a little further. Just a few more swaying steps across this marvel of engineering. I could practically taste the dates already. The shore, when I finally reached it, felt strangely solid beneath my feet. No more rocking, no more creaking timbers. Just good, honest Anatolian dirt. I took a deep breath, letting the dust and the faint scent of the sea fill my lungs. It wasn't exactly the perfume of the gods, but compared to the, shall we say, aromatic atmosphere of the marching column, it was practically ambrosia. The scene on the Abydos side was chaotic. Organized chaos, perhaps. Soldiers milled about, some already setting up camp, others just sprawled on the ground, staring blankly at the sky. Cooks were bustling around enormous cauldrons, the smell of something vaguely meat-like wafting through the air. Not date wine, sadly, but a definite improvement over gruel. I scanned the crowd, searching for a familiar face, a friendly guide to the promised land of fermented dates. "Looking for something, friend?" A gruff voice startled me. I turned to see a grizzled veteran, his face etched with lines that spoke of countless campaigns and probably a few close encounters with particularly nasty hangovers. He leaned on a spear, regarding me with a knowing smirk. "Date wine," I said without preamble. "The good stuff." He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Ah, a man of culture. Follow me, lad. I know just the place." And so, guided by my newfound Bacchus in arms, I navigated the bustling camp, dodging stray pack animals and bewildered recruits, my senses fixed on the increasingly intoxicating aroma of fermenting dates. The tavern, when we finally reached it, was a low-slung building made of rough-hewn timber, tucked away in a relatively quiet corner of the camp. The noise spilling out from within, however, suggested that quiet was a relative term. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled scents of date wine, sweat, and something I couldn't quite place but suspected involved a goat. The room was packed with soldiers, their faces flushed, their voices loud. Some were singing bawdy songs, others were arguing about the finer points of siege warfare, and still others were simply passed out on the tables. It was beautiful. My guide led me to a relatively empty corner, where a large clay jar sat on a low table. He dipped a ladle into the jar and offered me a brimming cup. "The finest Abydos has to offer," he said, with a wink. I took the cup, my hand trembling slightly with anticipation. I raised it to my lips, inhaled the rich, heady aroma, and took a long, slow sip. It was everything I had hoped for and more, sweet, potent, with a subtle hint of something that might have been figs, or possibly the aforementioned goat. Whatever it was perfect. I closed my eyes, savoring the flavor, letting the warmth spread through me. This, I thought, was what victory tasted like. The next few hours passed in a blissful haze. I lost track of how many cups I drank, how many songs I sang, how many stories I heard, and probably embellished. I vaguely remember arm wrestling a particularly enthusiastic Thracian, debating the merits of different chariot formations with a surprisingly knowledgeable scribe, and sharing a heartfelt lament about the lack of decent bathing facilities with a homesick Persian. At some point, I found myself lying on the floor, staring up at the ceiling, which seemed to be swaying gently back and forth. The sounds of revelry around me had faded into a distant hum. I closed my eyes, a contented sigh escaping my lips. Abydos, date wine, pontoons, life was good. And then the world tilted, and I succumbed to the sweet embrace of the Hellespont hangover. Persepolis. I hardly recognized it, and it likely wouldn't recognize me. Dust coated my threadbare robes, clinging to the sweat stains like a second skin. My sandals, once gleaming leather, were now worn near through, the straps frayed and loose around my blistered feet. I was a ghost drifting through the grand halls, a shadow flickering in the sun-drenched courtyards. Gone was the proud herald, the booming voice, the crisp linen, the gleaming torque. In their place stood a scarecrow, haunted by the steps, by the cunning eyes of the Scythians, by the faces of the men I'd led to their deaths. Darius's reign continued. The empire still held firm. Life, it seemed, went on, oblivious to the scars carved into my soul. The opulence of Persepolis, once a source of pride, now felt like a mockery. The bustling activity grated on my frayed nerves, the laughter of the courtiers a discordant symphony against the silent screams that echoed in my mind. I was a stranger in a familiar land, a survivor adrift in a sea of oblivious joy. My feet, almost by their own volition, carried me towards Nakshe Rustam. Not with the swagger of a victorious herald this time, but with the hesitant shuffle of a penitent. The towering tombs, carved into the cliff face, loomed over me, silent and imposing. They were a stark reminder of the grand pronouncements I'd once made beneath them, boasts of conquest and glory that now tasted like ash in my mouth. I climbed the worn steps, each footfall a heavy echo of my failure. The wind whipped through the crevices, carrying the faint whispers of Darius's pronouncements, his regal voice resonating through the ages, but another sound intertwined with his boasts. The ghostly whispers of the Scythians, their laughter mocking, their defiant cries a constant reminder of their elusive victory. I reached the platform before Darius's tomb. I didn't kneel. I couldn't bring myself to perform the elaborate rituals, the empty pronouncements. Instead, I simply stood there, head bowed, the wind tugging at my ragged robes. I closed my eyes, and the ghosts crowded around me. The faces of the men I'd led into the vast emptiness of the steppe, their trust in me now a crushing weight. I offered a silent prayer, not for myself, but for them, for the young soldier who dreamt of returning home to his family, for the grizzled veteran who'd fought with unwavering loyalty, For the scribe who'd meticulously documented our every move, his pen silenced forever. I prayed for forgiveness, not from the gods, but from the men I had failed. The silence of Naqashi Rustam was deafening. It was a silence that swallowed the grand pronouncements of kings, a silence that amplified the whispers of the dead. It was a silence that forced me to confront the hollowness within, the gaping wound where pride and ambition had once resided. As I trudged down the steps, I saw a group of young recruits preparing for a campaign. Their faces were bright with anticipation, their armor gleaming in the sun. They were eager to prove themselves, to carve their names into the annals of the empire. I watched them, a bitter taste rising in my throat. I wanted to warn them, to tell them about the futility of chasing glory, the chilling indifference of the steppes. But the words wouldn't come. They wouldn't understand. Not yet. They had to learn their own lessons, just as I had. I walked away from Naqshi Rustam, leaving behind the echoes of kings and the whispers of the dead. I was no longer the man who had climbed those steps so confidently just a few short years ago. The steps had stripped me bare, taken everything I thought I was. They had broken me, humbled me, forced me to confront the fragility of life and the ephemeral nature of glory. But in the process, they had also forged something new, something stronger, something more resilient. The steps had taken away my pride, my ambition, my illusions. But they had also given me something in return. They had given me the gift of perspective, the wisdom of survival, the understanding that true strength lies not in conquest but in endurance. I was no longer a royal herald. I was no longer defined by the titles I held or the pronouncements I made. I was something more. I was a survivor. And that, I realized, was a title worth more than all the gold in Persia. It was a title etched not in stone, but in the very fabric of my being. It was a title that would carry me through whatever trials lay ahead. A silent testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The journey back to myself had just begun. A long and arduous trek, but one was finally ready to undertake. The echoes of Naqshi Rustam faded behind me, replaced by a new sound, the quiet, steady beat of my own heart, a rhythm of survival, a promise of renewal. The dust had settled, literally and figuratively. Persepolis, that grand city of sculpted stone and towering ambition, pulsed once more with life. Market stalls overflowed with dates and figs. The scent of roasting lamb mingled with the perfume of exotic spices, and the rhythmic clang of hammers echoed from the workshops of artisans. Life, as it was wont to do, went on. But there was a subtle shift, a quiet undercurrent of change that ran beneath the surface of everyday life. The swagger in the steps of the immortals seemed less pronounced, their gazes less haughty. The courtiers' whispers in the palace corridors held a touch more caution, their pronouncements of invincibility replaced with more measured assessments of the empire's strength. Darius's grand misadventure in Scythia had, it appeared, chipped away at Persepolis's gilded arrogance, leaving behind a residue of humility, however thin. The royal sock drawer, however, remained fully stocked. One might argue that this demonstrated a continued disconnect from reality, a persistence of regal extravagance in the face of military setback. Or perhaps it was simply a testament to the efficiency of the royal laundry service. History, alas, offers no definitive answer. The real question, the one that has plagued historians for centuries, is whether Darius truly learned anything from his Scythian debacle. Did he emerge from the vast, unforgiving steppes a wiser king, humbled by his experience and determined to avoid such rash decisions in the future? Or was the whole affair merely a temporary inconvenience, a minor blemish on an otherwise illustrious reign? The scrolls are filled with conflicting accounts. Some scholars point to Darius's subsequent campaigns, his more cautious approach to expansion, and his increased focus on consolidating existing territories as evidence of a newfound pragmatism. They argue that the Scythian expedition served as a harsh but necessary lesson in the limits of Persian power. Others, however, remain skeptical. They contend that Darius's later successes were simply the product of circumstance, the result of facing weaker opponents and exploiting favorable geopolitical conditions. They portray him as a king who never fully grasped the strategic folly of his Scythian adventure, a man driven by the same insatiable ambition that had led him to the brink of disaster in the first place. Personally, I lean towards a different theory. I believe Darius did learn a valuable lesson from his Scythian campaign, albeit not the one most historians are looking for. I'm fairly certain he invested in a better beard. Think about it. Weeks spent traversing the windswept plains, exposed to the elements, with limited access to grooming supplies. That would take a toll on even the most majestic of facial hair. We know Darius took pride in his appearance. His meticulously styled beard, as depicted in countless reliefs and sculptures, was a symbol of his regal authority, a testament to his virility and power. Imagine the indignity of returning to Persepolis with a scraggly, wind-chapped mess dangling from his chin. The shame, the whispers in the court, the mocking glances from the Babylonian ambassador. No, Darius wouldn't stand for it. I imagine him summoning his most trusted advisors, his barbers, his perfumers, and demanding a solution. He would have spared no expense, commissioned the finest oils and combs, and perhaps even imported a team of specialist beard weavers from the distant reaches of the empire. He would have emerged from this grooming renaissance with a beard even more magnificent than before, a testament not only to his resilience but to his newfound appreciation for the finer things in life, like a good boar-bristle brush and a jar of imported Mesopotamian beard balm. Of course, this is just speculation. There's no mention of any royal beard-related expenditures in the surviving records. But consider the alternative. A king returning from a humiliating defeat, his beard a tattered remnant of its former glory. It simply doesn't fit the image of the great Darius. A man who could carve his achievements into the face of a mountain wouldn't tolerate a subpar beard. As for the larger lessons of the Scythian campaign, those remain a subject of ongoing debate. Did Darius truly change his ways? Did he become a more prudent ruler, tempered by the experience of near disaster? Or did he simply double down on his ambitions, seeking to regain lost prestige through further conquests? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. Perhaps he learned to pick his battles more carefully, to temper his ambition with a dose of pragmatism. Or perhaps he simply learned to pack a better travel kit. History, as always, is open to interpretation. But one thing is certain. The royal sock drawer remained full. And somewhere in the annals of Persepolis, I suspect, lies the untold story of Darius's epic beard restoration project. A testament, perhaps, to the enduring power of vanity, even in the face of geopolitical upheaval. The world may never know the full truth. But I, for one, choose to believe in the beard. The wind carried whispers, not of peace, but of horse hooves drumming on the distant plains. Whispers of Scythian shadows, lengthening across the northern border. They were not conquered, the rumors insisted, only temporarily inconvenienced. Like a swarm of wasps, swatted away but always buzzing back, their hunger for plunder never truly satiated. Quirky, these Scythians. I'd heard tales, probably exaggerated, of their warriors being buried with their weapons, horses, and get this, a supply of hemp smoke. Talk about the ultimate retirement package. If only the afterlife came with a good back-scratcher, it'd be perfect. My current retirement package consisted of training the local troops, a task I took surprisingly seriously. The border forts were manned by green recruits, more familiar with plowing fields than parrying blades. I drilled them relentlessly, sharing hard-earned lessons about steppe warfare, lessons carved in sweat and blood. Chasing nomads across vast, empty territories is like trying to catch smoke, I bellowed, my voice hoarse from shouting. You'll wear out your sandals and achieve nothing. Speaking of sandals, I added, holding up my own well-worn pair, invest in comfortable footwear. Trust me on this one. They stared at me, bewildered, but I saw a glimmer of understanding in some of their eyes. They'd learn. They had to. The northern wind was a harsh teacher, but effective. The best part of being back, though, was my family. Riding through the familiar streets of my hometown, seeing the welcoming glow of the hearth fire in the distance, felt like a dream. My children rushed out to meet me, their small arms wrapping around my legs. I hugged them tighter than ever, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and childhood that clung to their hair. The feeling was overwhelming, a powerful surge of gratitude for the life I'd almost lost in the desert sands. Papa, tell us about the giant scorpions, my son, Lucius, demanded, his eyes wide with anticipation. I ruffled his hair, a familiar warmth spreading through me. Later, little scorpion, I promised. Right now I need to hug your mother. My wife, Alara, stood by the doorway, her arms crossed, a knowing smile playing on her lips. She opened her arms, and I stepped into her embrace, the world outside fading away. She felt solid, real, an anchor in the storm. "Welcome home," she murmured, her voice a soothing balm to my weary soul. "It's good to be back," I replied, burying my face in her hair. Later, after the children were tucked into bed, Ilara and I sat by the fire, the flames dancing in her eyes. "You're restless," she observed, her gaze steady, "like a camel before a sandstorm." Speaking of which, our old camel, Cyrus, whom I'd brought back from the desert, much to Ilara's initial displeasure, snorted from the stable attached to the house. I swear he rolled his eyes. That camel was more perceptive than some senators I knew. "I am home," I insisted, taking her hand. "This is where I belong." "Your heart may be here," she conceded, tracing the lines on my palm, "but your mind is still chasing shadows across the steppes." She wasn't wrong. The whispers of Scythian raids continued to prick at the edges of my thoughts. The world beyond the familiar comforts of home, with its dangers and uncertainties, still held a strange allure. "The magistrates have been asking about you," Elara continued, her voice soft. "They're worried about the border." "I'm training the troops," I said, a little defensively. "That's enough." She raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" I sighed. She knew me too well. The quiet life of a retired soldier was appealing, but the call to action, the need to protect, ran deep in my veins. "There's a meeting tomorrow," Ilara said, her fingers interlacing with mine. "The magistrates want to discuss the Scythian threat. They'd value your input." I looked into the fire, the flames mirroring the flicker of uncertainty in my own heart. Part of me longed for the peace of obscurity, for quiet evenings by the fire with my family. But another part of me, a restless, adventurous part, yearned for the thrill of the chase, the challenge of facing the unknown. "The Scythians are a nuisance," I muttered, more to myself than to her. "Always have been." "A nuisance that needs addressing," Ilara pointed out gently. I knew she was right. The whispers of Scythian raids weren't just rumors, they were a harbinger of trouble. The northern wind carried the scent of danger, and I, despite my best intentions, was drawn to it. Like a moth to a flame, or maybe, more appropriately, like a camel to a particularly enticing patch of desert scrub. Cyrus snorted again from the stable. He was probably right. Retirement didn't suit me. Not yet. Not while Scythian shadows still stretched across the border, threatening the peace I'd fought so hard to protect. The comfortable sandals would have to wait. There were shadows to chase, after all, and maybe, just maybe, a few more stories to tell Lucius about giant scorpions. Years pass. I grow older, wiser, and considerably less interested in imperial edicts, or skullcups for that matter. Darius, that restless king, eventually died. Not amidst the swirling dust and cunning strategies of the Scythian steppes, but back in the heart of his empire, in Persepolis, surrounded by the trappings of his power. The news reached me like a sigh carried on the wind. The end of an era, the closing of a tumultuous chapter. I find myself drawn back to Nakshi-Rustam one last time. The wind whispers through the colossal tombs carved into the cliff face, a mournful chorus echoing the triumphs and defeats, the ego and resilience of kings long gone. The sun, a molten orb in the late afternoon sky, paints the rock in hues of orange and gold, highlighting the intricate carvings that depict Darius's victories, his lineage, his God-given right to rule. I run a calloused hand over the cool stone, tracing the familiar lines of the reliefs, a ghost of a smile playing on my lips. I've become a storyteller myself, you see, not a royal herald proclaiming the glories of the empire, but a witness, a keeper of memories. I share tales of the Scythian campaign, recounting the endless plains, the elusive nomads, the gnawing uncertainty that clung to us like a second skin. I speak of the dust storms that blotted out the sun, the chilling Scythian war cries that echoed across the vast emptiness, the constant fear of ambush that kept us on edge. I tell of the clever strategies employed by the Scythian queen Thamyris, of the burning pride and eventual frustration of Darius. I speak of the resilience of a people who valued freedom above all else, a people who refused to be conquered. My grandkids, however, are more interested in my Thracian goat-herding stories. Apparently, Tales of belligerent goats and precarious mountain passes are far more entertaining than the intricacies of imperial warfare. Go figure. They sit at my feet, eyes wide with wonder, as I recount the time a particularly stubborn goat decided to scale a cliff face, taking the entire herd with it. I chuckle, the sound raspy with age, and continue the story, embellishing it with each retelling. Perhaps there is wisdom in their preference, a reminder that the simple stories, the ones closest to the heart, are often the most enduring. Historians still argue, even now, whether the Scythian campaign was a complete failure, or a valuable lesson in the limitations of imperial ambition. Was it hubris that led Darius into those unforgiving lands, or a genuine desire to secure his borders? Did he underestimate the resilience and cunning of the nomadic tribes, or was he simply outmaneuvered? The answers, like the shifting sands of the desert, remain elusive. I trudge down the steps of Naqsh-i-Rustam, leaning heavily on my staff, each step a testament to the passing years. The sun sets over the necropolis, casting long, mournful shadows across the plain. The air cools, carrying the faint scent of dust and the ghosts of empires past. I am but a whisper of Naqsh-i-Rustam now, a living echo of a time long gone. My story, a small thread in the vast tapestry of history, serves as a reminder that even the grandest empires, the most ambitious rulers, can crumble in the face of steppes, strategy, and the stubborn will of nomads who refuse to be broken. The world softens around me. The sounds of the day, the chirping of crickets, the distant call of a night bird, fade into the gentle hum of a cooling desert night. The air is still, heavy with the scent of dust and the weight of centuries. My breathing slows, matching the rhythm of the wind whispering through the ancient stones of Naqsh-i-Rustam. I close my eyes, the image of the towering tombs imprinted on the back of my eyelids. I am safe here, held by the silence of the steppes, the weight of centuries resting lightly on my shoulders. The memories of the campaign, the faces of those I marched with, the endless expanse of the Scythian plains. They are all a part of me now, woven into the fabric of my being. The fear, the uncertainty, the exhaustion. They have faded with time, leaving behind a quiet understanding, a deep appreciation for the resilience of the human spirit. The story fades, dissolving into the stillness of the night. A sense of peace settles over me, a deep, abiding calm that comes from knowing that even after the longest journeys, even after the most harrowing experiences, we eventually find our way home, to a place of quiet reflection, a place where the whispers of the past can finally rest. Sleep now. The whispers of Naqsh-i-Rustam will keep watch,